And all right, it is going to YouTube stream. Go ahead.
And we want to welcome everybody for joining us this afternoon on the 4th of July. I think about the reason why we celebrate the 4th of July here. I think back at that important document that was signed by our founders of this country, the Declaration of Independence. In the second paragraph, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We want to talk about the extension of that. Now, some can argue who they were referring to back in that time when they signed that document, because some of the writers had slaves themselves, John Hancock, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. We want to talk about what's going on now with racism in this country, and particularly in this church. And I want to welcome our guest here, Dr. Clarence Hollinson. He was with us last week when we did the panel on racism, and I thought I would invite him to come back to spend a good hour with us, getting more into depth. Now, Dr. Hollinson is an author, a sociologist, an anthropologist, a theologian, and an adjunct professor of sociology at Andrews University. Now, when you look at his credentials, you will be amazed. He is well published, and let me just read a couple of things that he has published. He wrote an 8-part series in Adventist Today called Race in Society and Religion. He also wrote, Is Sociology Really Making a Difference? And Seventh-day Adventists and Race Relations in the U.S., The Case of Black-White Structural Segregation. This is what he did his doctoral dissertation in. And he wrote Racial Segregation Practice in a Religious Context. Another publication is Terror of a New Age, a Vivid Glimpse at the State of Humanity in a New Millennium. Now, he just recently put out a couple books, and you can find them in Amazon. They're entitled Dawn of the Apocalypse, Are We There Yet? A treatise in comparative eschatology. And his other book is Death of God, Is God Really Dead? So Dr. Hollinson, I want to welcome you and thank you again for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Hollinson, I just want to start with, can you just tell us who you are? Are you married? Do you have a family? Where you went to school? Give us a little background about who you are as we go into this discussion.
Sure. Married with kids, a couple of them, and one on the way. And thank God for his mercies and leading on with family life and all of that. My background, I attended an affiliate college of Andrews University. This one was called CUC, Caribbean Union College in Trinidad. And then I came to the seminary at Andrews in Berrien Springs. And from there, I moved to the Detroit areas. So essentially, I moved from the west side of the state, where Berrien Springs is in Michigan, to the east side of the state, all in the south, so southwest to southeast. So I'm outside of the Detroit area, actually very close to Canada, the Canadian border, around 20 minutes, 25 minutes away from the border. So I'm here now, and I did some of my study after my seminary degree, trained as a pastor in the seminary. I had questions, and questions were not being answered. Like, for example, I couldn't face evolution and race. In my undergrad years, which was in theology, I did not have that language. And it's only after seminary, when I went into social science and beginning with anthropology, then sociology, but with anthropology, that's when the Lord really impressed upon me and really opened that gate to social science, and he himself had to teach me. So it's not just me learning in the classroom, it's about the way the Lord has taught. And that's why the book I showed last time was one, by God's grace, I was able to write on evolution and how race, which was created and invented, is hitched to evolution and other ideologies. So that's part of my background. And I guess we'll get into the segregation in the church. But then after doing anthropology, sociology, then I was, of course, still not fully satisfied. Let me just say this, one of my master's degrees is in sociology, inequality, and I dealt with segregation in the church. And then that's in sociology, and then I carried it on to the doctoral program. So I kind of kept that same topic because it was on my mind. And so things went on from there.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Now, where are we going with this? Let me just kind of lay out sort of the format. Now, we're going to talk about history. We'll talk about the history. We're going to get into slavery and how Christianity was introduced to slaves, and then we want to kind of go through the history of how Christianity was introduced and how well it was accepted, how Adventism came into the picture, and then we want to end with so what. Okay, after all this we're talking about, the question is so what? Why do we need to talk about it? And then what do we do with all this information? Okay, so that's kind of the format that we want to go by. So the first question is, why is it important, or do you see it that this is important to talk about? Is history important for us to discuss?
Oh, most definitely. It may sound like an old cliche that if you don't know your history, you don't know where you're going. And of course, history informs the present and certainly is a guide to the future. So when we speak of history, whether outside the church or inside the church, it is important to be aware of our historical surroundings as much as we're aware of our physical surroundings. And so that's why when I study history in the SDA church, for example, I don't separate it, I don't see it as divorced from the wider societal history. As a matter of fact, they run hand in hand. It's interesting when you look at the two of them and see how they play out and how they inform where we are today.
That's right. Okay, thank you. So let's get into some terms. And we throw around a lot of terms, and I think a lot of us kind of just say these different words, not really knowing where they came from. We just hear other people talking about them. So let's start with 4 terms. Race. What is race? Racism. And white supremacy. Let's talk about that for a little bit. And then white privilege. What does that mean? So let's start with race. What does race mean? Where did that come from?
Yeah, race is a very, it has become a loaded term, but I will try to keep things brief. But so race, when we say race, it was, just to be clear, it was created, it was invented, engineered to suit and we call it a social construct, to suit the public's mind, their attitudes, their beliefs. So we say it's a social construct because it was made up in the mind of society. The context is 500 years ago, and that's how old race is, the race we throw around today. During the time of colonization, as I believe I pointed out before, but nonetheless, colonization and European expansion, and we go, especially like England, France, before that it was Spain and Portugal and so forth, and the Dutch, Holland, the Dutch Empire. But nonetheless, go out around the entire world, especially the English with Charles Darwin and some of the later theories and books coming out. We see people who look different from us. So what does that mean? And then it came down to, we, the English race, we know we're more superior than you, but we have to find a way to define it and to legitimize it. And that's how eventually slavery ended up working itself into not just society, but into the church. And you could find passages in scripture they use, like servant obey your master and stuff like that, to justify that. So race, to get to the heart of your question, there's no one definition for it. You may see things like a group of people marked by hereditary characteristics, maybe living in a certain region of the world, but all of this is myth. Because, and academia tells you this, it was invented.
And so with that comes racism. Are they the same thing? What are we talking about when we talk about racism?
Very good. And that's where the clarification comes in. So the way I explain it is, there is the construct of what was made, or the idea, but then there are also what we call the consequences of the construct. So, for example, when we've had lynching in this country for how long, going back to the 1800s, particularly Jim Crow in the 1860s, come all the way down into the mid-20th century, even down to this very day, we're still talking about lynching and cases of lynching. And it's only, believe it or not, last year an anti-lynching bill, after argument, I suppose, was passed, and it looks like they're still rambling over the final outcome. believe it or not. But nonetheless, so when we speak of the consequences, we speak of racism as an outgrowth of the idea of the superior mentality. I don't think I mentioned in the last segment, but there is, for example, under Nazism, I guess when you and I were speaking off the air, but Nazism, for example, in Germany, they actually picked up what we call eugenics, and eugenic ideas, the idea of the good birth from America and England. And that's around the 1920s. We have eugenic society in America, and I believe it's still alive today, the remnants of it, where we talk about who is of good birth and who deserves to die and not of a good birth. So when we say racism, it comes from that construct of we're superior and we look down on others. You are not as intellectual as I am. You don't have the same capability. And it's that idea of superiority over others.
Okay, so when we hear the words, the phrases white supremacy or white privilege, people tend to get offended. Are those words that should cause people to react that way?
There are at least two parts to that. So first, you look at the historical aspect. Where did the terms come from? And secondly, how has it unfolded over time? You could add to that, what does it look like today? So first, the historical aspect. In the early 1600s, Africans did not come as slaves to begin with. That narrative developed in the 1600s. So we look at around 1619, roughly. So you had what you call lower class whites. And by the way, I should say all this, preface this by also saying, when I use terms like black, white privilege, white supremacy, is not terms I necessarily subscribe to, especially black and white and so forth. But for conversation's sake, just to make that point clear, because actually they're more divisive when we say white, black, and others than helping. And maybe later in the conversation, I could explain why they're so divisive, like, for example, in the face of the current protest and how the language doesn't help. But nonetheless, so white supremacy and white privilege, to go back to a little bit of the history, as I said, so Africans did not come first as slaves, but indentured servants, just as whites. So whites and blacks were at the very same level. That is the working class, not those who own the land. So there's that distinction. As we went into the 1660s and 1670s, that's when the white label started to become real in America. Your marker is 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. After that time, white became more and more full-blown. But just before that, in the 1660s in Maryland, and so we're talking the 13 original colonies, all right? But in Maryland and Virginia in particular, Maryland, there was sort of the policy passed that whites are of a higher privilege status, and whites were not allowed to marry blacks, and that played into the narrative. That came into the 20th century as well. And so when we say white privilege, it was the creation of the white class, so to speak, or white grouping. And then, of course, blacks became the servants. So you have to detach them more and more and more and justify more and more and more. Before I turn it back to you, let me just give you an example of what we mean by white privilege so that it's sort of more concrete. In the 1930s, there was what you call the New Deal. Now, what's the New Deal? Amidst just around the time of the Great Depression, and you saw policies are being set to help people recover, sort of like today, back on their feet. Social security, a social net to help others. Well, this is the way the New Deal worked out. If you were in an agricultural position, if you were a domestic worker, all right, they had particular labels, maybe in a hotel work or house domestic work, you were not entitled to the deal. But what does that mean? Majority of people in those positions were African Americans. And what we call, well, non-whites, let's just put it this way. So that when we say white privilege, it means in a classic example like this, non-whites, quote unquote non-whites, are literally cut off from the benefits. And we could go into many other areas like housing, where housing is concentrated in the inner city and so forth and so forth. But that's to get to the heart of the issue.
So you mentioned indentured servants. Now, what role did the Irish, and Native Americans and, and poor whites? What role did they play before, what we call slavery?
Yeah, very good. The Irish is a very interesting case because the English, we know Ireland is very close to England and the northeast part of the UK. But nonetheless, the English turn their noses down at the Irish. They are of a lower class. Okay, even in Europe, you've had that sort of distinction between classes of people. As a matter of fact, to come back to that question, the Irish and the Native Americans, just to give you an idea, and as the specific year is 1924. In America, 1924, America passed an Immigration Act. And that act was influenced by, as I just mentioned earlier, eugenic policies who are worth of the good birth. Guess what they did? Even those from Eastern Europe were not allowed to come into America. They were not of as good birth or good stock as the Western Europeans, particularly England, France, Germany. So that sort of cut off, okay? And so, but now coming back to that's just giving an idea of how things get parsed out. Now come back to the Irish. The Irish, they were looked down upon as lower class citizens, and they would have actually, in the early days, do the work not even Africans would have done in America, like clear the swamps and so forth, because they were so low class. And of course, Native Americans were given, they worked the lands sort of side by side. As the story goes, they helped the white immigrants like the Pilgrims and the Puritans, where we get Thanksgiving from and so forth. They sort of help them till the land and harvest the first fruits and so forth. But then afterwards, of course, it came to land ownership, and the division and distinction came in. And so Native Americans, their labor was sought, but then Native Americans were not as submissive as later on as slavery unfolded. So because there's a reason for that, they knew the land and they knew how to escape, and they knew it much better than the Europeans coming in, the European immigrants. So they didn't have to take the hard labor and the oppression from the Europeans. And so that is why they were able to escape. And that's why you have so much skirmish and Native American wars. And today you have reservations where they sort of cut off semi-autonomously, pardon me. So that's some of that history.
Thank you. So how was Christianity introduced to slaves? We'll say slaves right now, and then we'll talk about post-Civil War time. Yeah,
very good. So slaves. So to begin with, let's go back a little bit. So Africans being brought over to the New World, what we call the New World, North and South America, Brazil, by the way. And by the way, Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to give up slavery, believe it or not. But nonetheless, they really treated them bad too. And so there's a whole history behind slavery across the globe, including the Middle East. But nonetheless, when they came over, Africans came over, they had no culture. That's in the quote unquote white mind, okay? Therefore, also, well, back up a little bit as well, whites coming over to America, you were not distinguished by race. Again, in the early days, early 1600s, in the very early days. But you were distinguished actually by sort of class and religion. Like if you were Christian, then you're in good standing and of a good family background and that sort of thing, not race, what we call race. That's to show you how this developed over time. And so with that idea, you're in good standing, you're considered a Christian. Africans now coming over to join you in, that triangular passage and coming over to the New World, and America in particular, as far as the whites were concerned, they don't have any culture. So, and that includes religion. You don't have religion, you have culture, you're sort of running around like uncivilized people. In fact, that was the portrayal of Africans. Therefore, we need to, as sort of your father, your caregivers, we need to teach you Christianity to help you be civilized. So that was the approach and how Christianity got introduced to the slaves. And of course, there's the history to that where blacks went to the same church with whites, so pre-antebellum, so before the Civil War. But they were segregated in the church before we even get to full-blown segregation of different buildings. So blacks had to know their place and sit in the back, or slaves, and you could not cross the boundary in the church, or in the balcony where you were designated to sit. All right. And so you have that idea that we must teach you and even tell you where to sit. So you had all of that coming in the early history. Yeah.
So when we talk about Christianity, we're talking about a knowledge of Christ primarily. Was it when the Africans came to America the first time they heard about Jesus Christ?
No, I want to say no, that is not the case. And the reason for that is the geographic region of where Christianity arose in what we call today the Levant or ancient Near East, today the region of Palestine. All right? So when Christianity arose in that region, there was, you want to remember the New Testament, for example, Philip and the eunuch, as the book of Acts pointed out, there was interaction, all right, in what we call the New Testament church. And people were not called Christians even in the time of Christ. It's only afterwards in Antioch. It was then, I want to say, in Syria, but today in Turkey. But in Antioch, they were first, according to the book of Acts, called Christians. And then, as I said, Philip and the eunuch from Africa, the Ethiopian, he heard about what they were preaching, the disciples. And so you could say that what we call Christianity permeated through East Africa. And of course, as an anthropologist, I know very well once something permeates, there's a tendency to travel. Like all of a sudden, people around the world sort of have the same ideas, and you wonder how could that be? And that's because of the sort of migration of culture or the migration of ideas. So I cannot say how far Christianity spread, but it was definitely in Africa, yes, at the time, early on.
Yeah. So let's go back for a minute. I alluded to the Declaration of Independence, and the framers of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, who we call our founding fathers, many of them had slaves. Now, many of them were deists, but some would consider many of them as Christian. How did the Christians at the time justify slavery, being Christian?
Well, actually, they go back again to New Testament passages. Obey masters, obey your servants. They would look at even in the Ten Commandments, they look for justification there as well. Trying to remember if they use the fifth commandment, but nonetheless, anything having to do with obey and submission, and you find it in both our New Testaments, that was actually used to justify slavery. As a matter of fact, we should look at two general eras in the early day, and what we call the first Advent Awakening and the second Advent Awakening. Now, I bring that up because, again, I'm placing it within the context of American history and society. So the first awakening, the name one name to keep in mind is George Whitefield. Around 1790 to the turn of the 19th century, early 1800s, the first awakening, first awakening would be, let's say, the 1700s, so the 18th century. Second awakening around 1790 or early 1800s up to 1844 with William Miller, Second Great Awakening. Okay. In the first awakening with the Wesleys, the Wesley brothers, where we get the Wesleyan church from, coming from England in the 1700s with George Whitefield, okay? The way it was regarded, and we'll go back to the framers, I just point out, looking at the parallel. Blacks, as far as they were concerned at that time in the first awakening, you should have blacks as servants and slaves. And it's in fact a good thing because you're teaching them the Bible, okay, with that same mentality. All right. So there was again that class distinction and so forth. In the framers' mind, like you asking, and some of the what we call founders had slaves, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Even Thomas Jefferson had a hard time because he wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And in that book, Thomas Jefferson is sort of looking at blacks as inferior. And he's sort of questioning the inferiority of that he had children with a quote unquote black woman, which as a matter of fact, recently his children from both sides reunited from the black side and the white side. And you could look that up on YouTube and so forth. But nonetheless, there is that tight contradiction. You're not intellectually as superior as me, you're inferior and so forth. So they find ways to justify using the Bible and servants, and you need to know your place and so forth. Certainly, yeah.
Now let's talk about Adventism, how Adventism came into, how Blacks started to accept Adventism. Talk to us about that. When did that begin and how did they accept it?
Sure. So when we say Adventism, so we're not speaking of Seventh-day Adventists per se, at least not yet. So here's where we go back to the name I just mentioned, William Miller, in the Second Great Awakening. And that is why I prefaced it with that, because that's going to play an important role. So in the Second Great Awakening, and Miller kicked off his campaign, to give an idea, 1831. He had the idea to spread the Advent message from around 1822, but around that time, early on. But he struggled. 1831 is sort of his big launch. Now, here is another interesting parallel for you. 1831 was also when William Lloyd Garrison launched his big movement and his paper, The Anti-Abolitionist Movement, from William Lloyd Garrison's side. And that's very interesting when you see the parallel between society and the church. But nonetheless, Black Adventists early on they certainly participated in what we call the Millerite movement. And again, the distinction, the focus was only on Adventist. Christ is coming. There's a second coming. When? Right now, this year, fall of 1843, and the dates got moved until October 1844. But Blacks, and I will give you a few names. William Foy from Portland, Maine, same region of Ellen White. As a matter of fact, he's considered to be the prophet before Ellen White. Not only that, but she actually cited a vision she saw which he related first. So you have this, and you've had that coming down the line in Adventist history, like coming out of Oakwood. If historians from Oakwood point that out, that you even had the Black prophet before what we call Ellen White, and also a couple other names, Charles Bowles. These were speakers, African American speakers with Miller in the Millerite movement. And there's another one, John Lewis, not the same U.S. representative from Georgia, but he happened to have the same name, John. But in this case, John W. Lewis. And he also wrote an autobiography of Charles Bowles. And Charles Bowles, one of those in the Millerite movement, one of those Blacks, he actually established churches. He spoke before white audiences. So they were accepted, however, not without tension. So some whites may have still felt, who does a Black person think he is to speak to me? You may have still had these attitudes, but at least you could still see Blacks early on speaking in the Millerite movement. Sojourner Truth, you're probably familiar with that name, in the Millerite movement herself as well. And she moved from New York to Battle Creek. And there she actually died in Battle Creek. So she's part and parcel of that. Frederick Douglass, you would know that name. His daughter, Rosetta Sprague Douglass, or Rosetta Douglass Sprague, she was an Adventist. Actually, she became a Seventh-day Adventist. That's a different label later on. But before Seventh-day Adventists, you did have the Black Adventists with the Millerite movement. And then if you want to get into Seventh-day Adventists, we could do a little bit of that.
Yeah. So do you recall Joseph B. Hines?
Yes.
Joseph
yes.
Hines.
Hines.
What do you know his role in the abolitionist movement?
Yeah, I believe he was one of those who, part and parcel, if I'm not mistaken, of the Underground Railroad, or speaking, giving voice against slavery. Because some of them in that time had come up to the pioneers of the SDA Church, spoke against slavery, so they were abolitionists. Many of them were very vocal. And Hines played a particular role with publishing. And that's where Hines really come in central to spread the word, not orally, but in paper and in print. And that's his big role. But I believe, yes, he did have a part to play in the abolition movement.
So is it fair to say that Ellen White, James White, and Joseph Bates, for all intents and purposes, the founders of Seventh-day Adventism, they were all abolitionists at the time?
Yes, yeah, they were abolitionists, you can say, and in fact, some of them pushed it a little stronger. And Ellen White herself pointed out with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, for example, that when people were supposed to return slaves back to their masters, the advice was, don't do that. Not only that, but face the consequences of that. So you did have that, and you did have writings coming out on that pre-Civil War, coming up in the 1850s, particularly in the 1850s, and the idea of the abolition movement in society, but in the church as well.
So let's talk now about the separation and segregation early on. What happened? What was the reason? What was the rationale? And then we're going to build up to where we are today with that.
Yes, certainly. So to make this sort of break, because the history and the evolution of that history comes post 1844, like we just spoke of, and you get into the 1850s, 1880s, 1890s. So touch on that briefly and then come around to the opening of the 20th century, or the turn of the 20th century, as it were. And I'll touch on some of those black key figures, and then come to the official segregation in the church. So early on in 1857, for example, in Michigan, there's a guy by the name of William Hardy, Hardy. Very interesting figure, because they're said to be the first Black Adventist, at least in Michigan. And his wife, Eliza Hardy, got baptized 1857. So this is before the church was organized. So a little bit of context. The church was organized in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War, or just before the war ended. But in 1861, 2 years prior to that, the Michigan Conference was organized. So the Michigan Conference was actually organized before the church was organized in 1863. And so that's part of that context. So in 1857, you had this family, although I understand the wife was Caucasian, but the man was Black, William Hardy, got baptized, and the pioneers spent time with him in his home. But here's where it's interesting. Around the 1870s, 1872, keep in mind, this is just post-Civil War. This guy is not only elder in his church in Michigan, the area around north of Grand Rapids, so central Michigan, which is predominantly white. He's elder of the church, or first elder, I want to say. Not only that, he's what we call mayor, they call him town supervisor back then, of his own town. And so we call them mayors today, mayor of a town called Gaines Township. And I had the privilege of 5 years ago to go to a dedication. They were dedicating a pond in his name. That's the city was dedicating, looking at this guy, William Hardy, which happened to also be a Black Adventist. So you had that sort of playing out. But now we're coming up to the segregation you're asking about. Okay, 1889, Charles Kinney is said to be the first ordained Black minister. All right, there's sort of a little bit of dispute. He may not have been the first, but he's recognized as that. 1889, at his ordination, Blacks could not be, there are two versions, they could not be in the same building with the whites. This is Adventist. But there's also, I've seen another version where the Blacks are to stand outside the building or tent, whatever the case was, for his ordination. So there was segregation, sort of white supremacy attitudes in the church that early on. So much so that the segregation of conferences like you're asking about, it goes back to around that time as well, 1880s with Charles Kinney. And the idea was proposed to have segregation of the conferences in the 1800s. So, but it pained Charles Kinney in his heart. It literally pained him. He was aching. How could I do this according to him in light of the three angels' messages? The man was hurting. When I read the history of it, I could like feel his pain, literally feel his pain. And so he pained in his heart, but nonetheless, you come to the 1890s, Edson White. So this is the White son, Ellen and James. Edson White, Beelzebub, Morning Star, long story, so try and make it brief, went down the Mississippi. Okay, spread the word. I'm sure your viewers are aware of that sort of history. And then leading up to Oakwood, what we call Oakwood Industrial School, became Oakwood College, now Oakwood University. Edson sort of laid some of that groundwork. And of course, there was tension between whites and blacks then. This is around 1894, to be more precise. All right, so this is where we come to the 1900s. So we're climbing up to 1900s, and now we're rounding the century into 1901. Classic cases are arising. There are two key figures here in the Black work in Adventism. One is a guy by the name of Louis C. Schiff, and another is James K. Humphrey. Okay. Interestingly enough, Louis C. Schiff is a Baptist minister turned Adventist. Same thing with James K. Humphrey, for some reason, in Baptist denomination to an Adventist minister. Louis C. Schiff gets ordained 1897, and James K. Humphrey around 10 years after that in 1907. This is context for the segregation we see today in the church. James K. Humphrey in particular lies right dead middle of the whole controversy, all right, of the whole story. So guys like Louis C. Schiff, he was with the church in Washington, D.C. area, but he was more for integration, but the church wouldn't have integration really, or they didn't push integration like he saw it, like all members are the same. And so there's not official segregation here, but of course you'd find Black congregations, right, or predominantly Black. But he was more for integrating, bringing everybody together, so forth. But anyway, his frustration, just like James K. Humphrey, they led to both of them leaving the church. In Louis C. Schiff's case, he left more than once. However, in James K. Humphrey, there's a distinction. He was actually kicked out. And we're coming to that and to the run-up of the segregation in the church. So James K. Humphrey's tenure with the church, 1901 to 1930, 30 years roughly. Okay, let's make it brief. James K. Humphrey in the 1920s is impacted by the Harlem Renaissance, this huge outburst of Black intellectualism and Black literature and this. And so Harlem was considered the Black capital of the world with Black culture. Why is that important? James K. Humphrey is smack middle of that in Harlem, exactly where the movement is happening, together with Marcus Garvey, this huge guy which talks of African pride, where later on Malcolm X and his family were followers. But nonetheless, so here is James K. Humphrey. And what he's trying to do in the 1920s is to build a place called Utopia Park. The longer term is something like Utopia Park Benevolent Health Association, abbreviated Utopia Park, as a retreat for the marginalized. Of course, we know they're predominantly African Americans, marginalized, as I mentioned before, oppressed in the church. What does oppress? You couldn't climb up. There was no social mobility. A couple examples. If you in the Adventist church and you were Black, you could not send your children not just to grade schools in the Adventist church, even if you support the church financially. You could not attend nursing school in the Adventist church if you're Black. You could not attend a theology program. Now, of course, to be fair, there was also quotas like Andrews University, previously called Emmanuel Missionary College, EMC. Okay, there was a quota for Blacks. So whatever the number was, if it's 20 Blacks or 50 Blacks, you reach that quota, that's it. No more Blacks, regardless. So there was a quota, we can't say in places, but there were also places where you couldn't go in. For example, Union College, an Adventist college in Nebraska, one of Humphrey's members couldn't get in because, of course, he was Black, as the story goes. Okay, so now let's move forward, 1929. 1929, the GC impanels a commission to study two key questions, two key issues. One is recommendations for the Black work in North America in the Adventist church, and two, what is it about segregated conferences? The idea is, should we have segregated conferences? This is 1929. I need to back up a little bit and come forward because around 1909, 1910, there was the creation of what they call the Negro department in the GC. So you have, just like you have women's ministry, youth ministry, there was a quote unquote Negro ministry or Negro department. And by the way, a white was head of the department until later on, where you had a Black by the name of Green. He's actually from Detroit area. Interestingly enough, the white head of the Negro department, they could have the office at the GC. But when it came to the Black leader of the Negro department, he couldn't have his office there, right? Because again, Blacks could not be equal to whites. And even the cafeteria at the GC, Blacks could not dine in there. I don't believe they could dine, and if they could, it probably was segregated. But I don't believe they could even dine in the GC cafeteria. So 1929, so given all this oppression, I just sort of explained the oppression, and Humphrey's trying to build this Utopia Park for his members. The Greater New York Conference, the white conference, there were no regional conferences at that time, just all white conferences and white dominant leadership. The whites dominated. They wanted to have their hand in it. In other words, everything must be white control. It even comes down to the deeds of the church and property. Who owns the deed? You blacks, no, you're not supposed to own the deed. That goes back to white hands. So Humphrey is up against all of that. So in his mind, we need segregation because we're too oppressed. So black ministers did in fact push for that early on. And the panel, go ahead.
Okay, let me interrupt you just for a minute. Let's go back a little ways.
Yeah.
Whose idea was it to separate? Because post-Civil War, blacks and whites worship together.
Yes.
Whose idea was it to separate? Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yes. Yes, I'll touch that, then come forward. I want to say, if the name serves me correctly, a guy from Tennessee in the Adventist education work by the name of Kilgore. I think there's the name Bell too, but Kilgore comes to mind. Guys like this were sort of looking at the tension, or rather that blacks should minister to blacks and so forth. So that's again going back to Charles Kinney time, that the blacks, and remember, blacks could not even be together with whites at his ordination. And so the idea was the blacks should minister to the blacks, and we should have separate conferences. So it goes back, it wasn't the black idea to answer your question, certainly not. It was, again, that's coming from a prejudiced mindset, okay, anti-black prejudice. So now you come back to James K. Humphrey and 1901 come up the road, all right? The black ministers all this time, from Charles Kinney time all the way to Humphrey and so forth, the black ministers are feeling the pain, okay? They're literally oppressed. They cannot build, like James K. Humphrey in his case, couldn't build his Utopia Park, couldn't fulfill his vision, because the white members had to have control. And by control, the deed to the building, the control maybe over what you do, when you come, whatever the case was, you had to have white control. That's why black ministers wanted the segregation in Humphrey's time, 1929. And so that's where we left off. And so the panel in 1929 was supposed to answer that question as well. Should we have segregated conferences? A majority white panel, it may have been 7 whites, 4 blacks. Humphrey was on the panel. The answer was no. You will not get segregated conferences. This is from the white leadership of the church, GC, so forth. No segregated conferences. Not only that, don't even think about asking for it again. Okay, that's it. End of story. This is 1929. Now then, Humphrey gets ejected out of the church shortly thereafter, 1929, 1930, over this whole Utopia Park, as I mentioned, and the white control and the struggle. So he got disbanded, he and his congregation he had one of his churches with 600 members. And this is a big congregation for the 1920s, and it spilled over into a second congregation, and they had more than that too, I want to say. But nonetheless, he is ejected, disbanded from the church, except 5 members who sided with the conference. All right. So now what does Humphrey do? He forms his own church called United Sabbath-day Adventists. Now I should back up a little bit. Remember I spoke of Louis Schiff. And with Louis Schiff and a guy by the name of John Mann, M-A-N-N, I believe from Georgia area, but nonetheless, John Mann, together they formed, on Louis Schiff time, they also formed another breakaway movement. So these are at least 2 black churches that came out of the General Seventh-day Adventist Church over racial oppression. So one is, and the one with Louis Schiff and John Mann was called Free Seventh-day Adventists. They're actually alive and well today in Michigan, and they've actually grown internationally. They're not really heard of, but they're there. And the other one is J.K. Humphrey's church, J.K. Humphrey United Sabbath-day Adventists. It's a trickle down now, a skeleton of its former self, but they're there on record. And so come up to 1944 now, the official segregation. So 1929, don't ask for it. Humphrey is ejected around 1930. Before we get to 1944, very briefly, Oakwood College in Alabama, there's this big protest in 1931. What are Oakwood College students protesting? Well, apparently they heard about James K. Humphrey, and of course they know about injustice, but not only that, they're feeling the squeeze themselves. This is, and as I understand it, there was protests 1910 at Oakwood College, we're speaking of 1910, 1931, and 1930s, and the 1960s with Martin Luther King when he came to speak at Oakwood, okay? But 1931 in particular is the big one. What are they complaining about, Oakwood College students? We are under a white gaze, okay? Whites are over our back. So Oakwood College was founded in 1896, and they always had a white president, okay? But here's the heart of the issue. Oakwood College students were not even considered intellectual enough to have or to engage in a liberal arts degree or liberal arts program, humanities and liberal arts. Similar to Booker T. Washington and his industrial work in the South, in Tuskegee, Alabama, the idea was we we're going to teach Black folk industrial work. Same idea with Oakwood College. You go to learn industrial work, sewing, particularly agriculture. You must learn to work the land. Now that's fine. But the point was you're not intellectual enough. And this was all white supremacy to allow you to have humanities. No. That's too good for you. And liberal. So Oakwood students, 1931 now, big protest. You know what they did? They wait a day until when the school board was going to meet. So they literally timed the protest. And they say, aha, today we're going to protest. So that the voices, the idea was to maximize the effect. They shut down the school. These are the students. Post a student at every building, okay? Ring the bell. Make sure everyone knows we're not having classes today. No. Shut down the gates from police entering. Close the school down, okay? And now we want our voices to be heard. And as I said, that went on into the 1960s. Martin Luther King was supposed to come speak at Oakwood. Of course, the church didn't want that. And when I say church, the white leadership predominantly, you would say, which is in control, largely speaking at the GC level in particular. Why? Because the idea is when we say social justice and protest, this is a big no in the Adventist church. You don't go out protesting. So that was, and even if that has come down to our day, there's a number of reasons for that I could share afterwards with you if you'd like, in a follow-up question if you'd like. But nonetheless, Martin Luther King came to speak at Oakwood, and there were strict rules for that as well. Now, I say that to give you the context to the segregation in 1944. So leave 1931, come all the way, oppression, fall of 1943. And I wouldn't go into the story of Lucy Bayard in detail again because I mentioned it last week. But very briefly, this lady comes to the hospital, Lucy Bayard looking white, went through the racial detectors of the Adventist Hospital, Washington Sanitarium in Maryland, not DC, until they realized, wait, you're not white. And so they reverse course, eventually look around, found this hospital in DC across state lines and DC borders. It's right in the heart of Maryland, but DC is its own subunit. And so they found the Freedmen's Hospital, today's Howard University. And that was not the first case, as I understand it, of Blacks being turned away at Adventist hospitals. But just like George Floyd, where we talk about people are feeling the oppression, for them, that was the last straw. That's where the members said enough is enough and went straight to the GC president, J.L. McElhaney. And then they sat with him, and here is the key I want people to really get. They were not asking for segregation. So this is the distinction. What the members were asking for, now prior, as we said, Black ministers were asking for segregation because of the oppression. So we want to make those points distinct and clear. But the laity, the members are saying, you are disrespecting our pastors. So what do we want? We can't send our children to your schools and so forth. So what do we want? Respect, equality. These are your two big factors. As far as the GC and the SDA white leadership was concerned, you cannot be considered our equal. Therefore, here is your segregation. All right, the same one we told you 13 years earlier, or around 15 years earlier. Don't even think about asking for it again. And this is where, and I use those terms again, like white supremacy is embedded in the church, because you cannot be equal to us white. So why are you even asking to be on our own level? And so the story developed from there.
Thank you. Let me give you a breather here. That's a lot of good information.
No problem.
Let's go back to Ellen White. In volume 9 of the testimonies, page 200, 202, she said she felt pain for the colored people, is how she referred to it, how whites were treating them, and thought that we should allow them to have churches and nice churches and provide education and have all the types of benefits that whites had. But she saw the problems that came about because of some of our white brethren weren't comfortable being with blacks in church. So it got to a point where their lives, some of those who were working with the blacks, their lives were being threatened. So she told her son, and she wrote it, I think it was in the Southern Work.
There is a Southern Work, yeah.
Yeah, she said, until the Lord shows us a better way, it's best that we separate. So the question is, has God shown us a better way yet? What do you think?
I would answer this by saying this is a nice rhetorical question. And the reason for that is, now I could give you my answer like I did last time for example, when I mentioned that we go into our closets and pray, just to take it from there and come to your question today, to connect those two. The whole point was, since white supremacy may still be prevalent, may still be prevalent in the Adventist church, not just society. Why? Because we still have white flight, for example, in SDA churches. So very briefly, so many blacks come in, or non-whites, whites flee away to the suburbs or wherever, and then blacks come, they may flee again. Just like we have white flights from neighborhood, but this is happening in the Adventist church. All right, and we have those issues. So the sort of the question is there let's go back to the pray in your closets. And so this is why I said last time, we need to pray individually, open our hearts, because there's so much gunk and junk and agendas. All right, put that aside. But are we willing to put personal agendas aside and go and pray and say, Lord, I need wisdom, I need strength? Are we willing to do that? And that's why I made that point last week. Now to join it with what you're asking now, all right, and the sort of the relevancy today, and sort of the segregation today and how that's still unfolding. And do we need that segregation? What about the segregation today? And Ellen White's counsel, like you mentioned, the counsel that until the Lord shows a better way is the heart of what you're asking. So the question, that's why I asked the rhetorical question I will ask, is do we have a better way? And the better way, I would prefer to hear other people's answer. But I would just start off by saying that a better way would be, as I just said, pray individually in your closet and ask for strength, because this thing we call racism in not just society, but in the church, as it is ugly and nasty. I mean, it's very deep and wide. And it's that bad. That's exactly why I mentioned the idea of praying about it first. So to answer do we have a better way now? That's really up to individual members, not only individuals, but the structure from GC down also has to take stock and ask themselves, are we willing? So you have the structure and the individual, but it begins with the individual. Maybe the individuals could put pressure on structural leadership. Go ahead.
I thought it was interesting you mentioned the three angels' messages, and I recall Charles Finney. He said something when he was as a pastor. He said the third angel's message has the power in it to eliminate and remove the race prejudice upon the part of those who get a hold of the truth. What is the connection between the three angels' message and slavery, racism, segregation, and all that?
Yes, and same with Charles Finney. And I'm glad you brought up Charles Finney. Now, are you referring to Charles Finney or Charles Kinney?
Charles Kinney.
Oh, Kinney, pardon me, I heard Finney.
Kinney. Mm-hmm.
I actually wanted to go back to Finney, so I'm glad you brought that up. But Kinney, since you're asking about Kinney in particular, Kinney saw a direct correlation with the three angels' messages, because in it is wrapped up not just freedom, as the heart of the gospel, as you could detect from the heart of the gospel, freedom in the Lord and so forth, nothing like, although strangely, oddly enough, people actually look at gospel messages to justify segregation in the Adventist church, believe it or not. And just a real quick example, when Jesus healed the demoniac with the evil spirits and said afterwards, go and show, he wanted to follow Jesus, and Jesus said, go show yourself to your own people. Believe it or not, I've heard blacks use the justification, I guess a black person use it to say, go minister to your own people to justify segregation. Believe it or not. So this kind of justification is permeating through. So this is where you still have tension up to today. That's just one example. And so with Kinney's view, there's freedom for him. And as people see freedom in the gospel, but in the third three angels' messages, because again, you're speaking of eschatology and the end. Are we speaking of going to a segregated heaven? Okay, are we, when we say we're giving glory to God, are we speaking of whites in one corner and blacks here? And even if we use the argument of worship style, but that's actually, it can be used as an excuse. I understand why people use it, but the question is, can you get past it? And there's literature to show how you could actually get past it. But that's how Kinney felt in his heart, and he felt the contradiction. This is a huge contradiction that you couldn't really have, and that's why he was aching in his heart.
So you mentioned, and I agree with you, calling each other black and white, they are in themselves just divisive terms. What would sound better? What would be better? Would it be African American? And what would sound better?
Brother and sister. Now, if you want to say African American, and the reason why I say brother and sister is because we need to get back to the idea that we have the same family. So I'm not sure if I pointed this out last time, but there are two key views in that regard. One is called monogenesis, meaning all humans came from the very same two parents. Okay, mono meaning one genesis beginning. And there is also polygenesis, with many beginnings, which says that humans came from different lines. So they're not all the same. And some, you may find subhumans. And that's why you have the crooked ideologies and twisted ideologies of certain humans cannot be, they cannot equally produce, or they may be infertile with certain other humans. So in other words, not all human species are the same, or not all humans are the same, because they cannot even breed. They may not be able to breed together. Of course, all that's myth, right? And the way you talk about infertility, if you mix the races and quote, it's all myth. Anthropologists, as you know, I have a background in anthropology. We know all of these are lies and myths. And I don't know if I pointed out on this show because I'm elsewhere, but just to give you an example of how academia is sort of approaching it, there is what you call the the American Anthropological Association. This is another AAA, AAA. And today, what they are doing is they're going around the country, and there is a traveling exhibit teaching people what race is not. It's a construct. It was invented, and slavery, and they talk about all that, how it was invented. And I had the opportunity to visit it, and I was glad for the opportunity because it's all around the country. It keeps moving. And I had the opportunity to go into Flint, which is not too far from me, to visit that exhibit not too long ago, to see with my own two eyes, right? This is what's happening in public. So they're actually telling you this, but it's not trumpeted loud enough. So yeah, with these ideas, it's not that easy when you have the ideas you're so stuck and hung up on them. But yeah, back to you.
Not too long ago, a news reporter was assigned to go to a union conference meeting. And he asked this question. I thought it was interesting when I read it. He said, "What is there in Adventism that attracts so many Black people? I always thought that the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a white church. What is it that attracts Black people to Adventism?" I think last figure I heard was about 25% in North America. Blacks made up 25% of the North American Adventists.
It may be around that because what we call, quote unquote, the white population in Adventism is declining, or has plateaued and declining. So what you have is Blacks and Hispanics and immigrants, quote unquote immigrants, making up the numbers in the Adventist church. So it may be somewhere around there. And Blacks are really interested, as others, in what's called the remnant message. That's key for them. So regardless of segregation or not, for some reason, the remnant message, for some reason, resonates. And it sort of goes back also to the time of Frederick Douglass, and when Frederick Douglass himself saw the falling of the stars, and that sort of shook him. And it was like, maybe this is a harbinger of things to come. And so for Blacks, And it also comes out of the idea of freedom, that there is a better day coming in the sky. And so looking forward to that day. And maybe even in some Blacks' minds, we don't need to deal with the segregation now because the second coming will deal with all that. So you may find that sort of ideas in whites and Blacks' mind, both among whites and Blacks in the Adventist church, that really is the second coming and the remnant message. This is where our focus needs to be, not on segregation.
Amen. Amen. Okay, I have two more questions, and this last this one question is kind of a what do we do? So, given what's happening in our world now with injustice, police brutality, and all that, what should our response be? Should it be a Christian response, an Adventist response, or a secular response?
To touch on the last part, the secular response is, it has a beginning. So when we speak of, whether it's all lives matter or whatever the case is, of bringing people protesting in brutality and injustice in society, that has its place, but it's not the totality. The reason for that is we could speak of social justice and moving forward, but as long as, to be quite frank and honest, okay, which is the way I prefer to be and have it, as long as we're speaking of the labels, black, white, and so forth, what you're going to find is people's going to be spinning their wheels in an endless rut. And I sort of mentioned that with the Dylan Roof case in South Carolina, where he killed those people in the church and they turned around and embraced and forgave the murderer, the killer, the victims. I also use that to show how Adventists could use that as a reconciliation model as well. That's one example. But so when you speak of social injustice and so forth, and what do we do? The language we actually use, and you were asking a little bit ago, do we still use those terms, white, black, and so forth? The very language we use matter. So language matters. And because if I keep calling you white and I keep calling you black, it has connotations, even if subconsciously or consciously, because it's already built, for example, white privilege and who owns and who does not. Even if white, you can broad brush whites and say you all are racist and you all are prejudiced, and they're not all the same. But the point is, it's built into the structure, the white privilege. So that's why he's still using terms like white and black in the world's model. It's not productive at all. So there are two other aspects you asked. Do we go with Adventist and also Christian? And the answer really lies again in personal, looking at your individual heart before God and ask, where does he want me? Where does he want me to be before we come to the table? So rather than bring my own agendas and my own mind, so if it comes down to Adventist leaders or come to the table, regional conference and state conferences, just like you have Georgia Cumberland and you have other conferences, whether it's Southeast or Northeastern and Lake Region Conference. Let's come to the table. We're not speaking of let's dismantle it overnight. At least let's come to the table after you pray first and ask for direction. And I'll say this quick while I turn it back over to you, because that's one of the things bring up. There are two sides. Charles Finney, which I thought you mentioned, but interestingly enough, that's what I thought I heard. But Charles Finney and Ellen White, real briefly, and then back to you. To give you an idea of the degrees of what we call segregation. So for Charles Finney in the second grade, I spoke of George Whitefield, first Great Awakening. Yes, we need slaves. Slaves obey your master. When we came to the second Great Awakening with Miller and Ellen White and so forth, Charles Finney, the great preacher, notable preacher there, as far as he was concerned, blacks, he was against slavery, so abolition. But was he against blacks and whites sitting together in the church? So that's the other level. So yes, you could abolish slavery, but what about coming together, blacks and whites in the church? That's where he started to depart, okay? So these are degrees of what we call social distance, just like you heard that term thrown around today. So I would be comfortable and say slavery is wrong. But if you were to come and mingle blacks and white in the church, no, let's not get that comfortable. And then also now it comes a little bit closer. What about marriage between blacks and whites? And that has been an issue in the Adventist church, with some taking Ellen White's counsel that blacks and whites shouldn't marry. One of the reasons was for the children's sake. And of course, in Ellen White's time, there was what you call anti-miscegenation, which means blacks and whites should not be married. Not only that, there were state laws. I thought 1967 was the last law in Tennessee to get rid of this, but I understood recently, up until the year, if you can believe this, 2000, the last anti-miscegenation law where it was illegal for blacks and whites to get married, up to the year 2000, we still had this on the books in a southern state. So, and that crept into the Adventist church as well. And so even Adventists in particular, I have literally seen it with my own eyes in Adventist writing. This is another guy in the Adventist church picking up on Ellen White, and the idea is blacks and whites should not get married. Now, I say all this to say that there are some of these types of stumbling blocks when it comes to social distance and how comfortable are we to each other. So are we comfortable abolishing slavery? Adventists would say yes. Are we comfortable in the same church? Some say yes, some say no. Are we comfortable marrying each other? Some say definitely not. And some say, I don't have a problem with that. So all these tensions have to be sort of worked out. This is where, again, and as I turn it back over to you, where we go into our closets and pray that the Lord searches, gives us wisdom and strength to deal with this.
Amen. So when we began, I said we're going to talk about the history, and then we want to end with the so what part of it.
Exactly.
So here's part of the so what, and you can add whatever else you want to add to the so what. But what can we do as a local church to bridge that gap, the segregation, or bring down the wall, that partition that the Apostle Paul talked about? What can we do on a local level as a church to facilitate that?
Yes. Before I answer that, are we getting questions from the audience or just us? Okay. So at the local level, very good. What can we do? Again, first pray individually, and then we stick to now come to the table like we did last week, and I've done on other forums, even at Andrews University at PMC. I was on a forum there with various people talking about this. So the idea is to be open, have our arms ready to embrace each other. But when we're embracing with tears or whatnot, we must know why we're embracing. So first we admit, we pray individually, pray collectively, admit. There's white supremacy, there's white privilege in the church, not just outside the church. There's all this type of injustice and egregiousness. So first you admit, and this is part of the process. When we could have, but individually at the local level, even if GC, from GC president on down, and state conferences and regional conferences don't want to come to the table yet to at least speak. You've had little talks here and there, but it's not full blown between conferences. But if we don't want to come to the table full blown, at least, like you asked him, on the local church level, Duluth, whether it's Atlanta or Georgia, South Carolina, let's come together in the local church. Invite a regional church, like in your case, belong to the state conference, right? Invite the regional church. Let's come together on a Saturday afternoon. For now, I understand churches are not meeting in person. So you could even do it online if you want, or in the backyard. I understand people are meeting in the backyard and spacing out, because I don't want to give incorrect instructions. So, but I understand some are meeting in the backyard. You could do that. And then you could at least show we come together and we could speak together. But we speak in friendly tones. First of all, we ask, how are you doing? So first of all, we recognize the humanity in each other. And then the conversation picks up from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hollinson. And I really appreciate you spending this time with us. And I hope that one day, once the COVID issues and challenges are over, you can actually come and visit our church, because I'm sure that our congregation, those who are watching, have questions of their own. But this has really been this has been very educational. And I think, and again, I thank you so much. And I'm glad I ran into you as I read one of your articles. So you will hear from me again. And thank your wife so much for allowing us to steal you away from her as well.
Sure. And let me just say you're very welcome, and feel free to keep in touch anytime. So, and God bless.
Well, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll close for today. Father, we thank you so much for your grace and your mercy toward us. Lord, you knew from the beginning of Adam and Eve, what would happen in this world. all the evils that have occurred because sin entered the world. But Father, you also know the end. You know the end of the story. That one day we will all come together. We were all made as one blood, and we will worship together around you. You with your with the capital of the universe is going to be here on this, your kingdom, or your throne will be part of the capital of this universe. And Father, we're going to gather together, and we're going to all be the same as we are. There's going to be Asians and Puerto Ricans, and there's going to be Filipinos, and there's going to be all of us there just worshiping and enjoying the time that we're able to spend with you throughout eternity. Until that time, Father, help us to be faithful, and help us to do as Dr. Holland said, recommended, local churches coming together, fellowshipping with each other, speaking kindly to each other, and all those things that, so in the end, you'll look at us and say, well done, thou good and faithful servants. But until then, Father, help us to be faithful and do the work you have called us to do. So thank you for hearing and answering our prayers. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.